Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and Only the Cross Was Missing, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Only the cross was missing. The bloodstains were still fresh on the floor when Father Brown stepped into the room, the smell of iron in the air. It wasn't the kind of crime he had ever expected to face in this quiet village. The victim, a beloved parishioner, known for her generosity, lay lifeless, but it wasn't her death that raised the hairs on Father Brown's neck. It was the fact that the cross, her most cherished possession, was gone. The one thing she carried with her every day, the emblem of her faith, had vanished, and with it, any trace of a simple crime. Something far darker was at play. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, just a calm, eerie stillness that hung in the air. Her body was positioned in such a way that seemed almost deliberate. But Father Brown had seen enough to know that what appeared simple was often anything but. The cross, missing, was a symbol of something much larger than the crime itself. Why would someone take it? What did it mean? Father Brown knelt beside her, eyes scanning the room, taking in the details that others would overlook. A single candle flickered weakly on the nightstand, its light casting long shadows that danced across the walls. It wasn't the marks of the crime that intrigued him, but the silence. It was too perfect, too controlled. There was a message here, but it wasn't clear yet. Something was being hidden, and he would find it, no matter how deep it was buried. The first clue came when he looked closer at the victim's hand. It wasn't the bruises that stood out, but the faint impression of something pressed into the palm. The cross, perhaps, or something else. The question gnawed at him as he continued to investigate, every step feeling more like a descent into a twisted game of shadows. But as he turned the room over in his mind, he realized this wasn't just about a missing cross. It was about what it represented and why it was taken. It was at that moment that he heard the whispers. Not the kind of gossip one might expect in a village like this, but something darker. Father Brown knew instinctively that the whispers weren't meant for him. They were meant for someone else, someone hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. He followed the sounds, creeping down the narrow corridor and into the parlor, where the door was cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of light. There, in the corner, stood a figure, cloaked in darkness. They turned when they heard Father Brown's footsteps. A woman, her face obscured by shadows, her eyes as cold as the tomb. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough to make Father Brown's pulse quicken. What was her connection to the victim? Why was she here? Her silence spoke volumes. The longer he stood there, the more the air thickened with unspoken truths. But the truth, as Father Brown well knew, was never simple. He turned back to the body, his mind racing. The missing cross, the whispered warning, the cold figure in the shadows, it all tied together, but the pieces refused to form a coherent picture. Then came the first big reveal, something so shocking it almost stopped Father Brown in his tracks. As he examined the floor near the victim, he spotted a faint indentation. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. He bent closer, his breath catching in his throat, as he recognized the mark. It wasn't a footprint. It was the shape of a hand, perfectly pressed into the dust, and the fingers curled inward, as though reaching for something or someone. His mind raced. Had the killer left this behind, or was it something else entirely? But before he could make sense of it, a voice broke the stillness. The woman in the parlor had spoken, though she hadn't moved. "It's not what you think, Father," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "You're too late. The truth was never meant for you." Father Brown froze, the words echoing in his mind. Too late? The truth? What truth? He turned to face her, but by the time he did, she was gone, vanishing into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. There was no sign of her, no trace, nothing to indicate where she had gone. With a sinking feeling, Father Brown knew that the missing cross was merely the surface of something far more insidious. What had started as a simple murder had now become something more, something far more dangerous. He could feel the pull of it, the weight of a mystery that was deeper than any he had faced before. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized that the path to the truth was a treacherous one. He had to act, but every step forward only seemed to take him further into the darkness. The missing cross was a symbol of something much greater. But what? And why was someone willing to go to such lengths to cover it up? As Father Brown prepared to leave the house, his mind churned with the questions that refused to be answered. Who had taken the cross? And why? The answers were just out of reach, slipping through his fingers like sand. But one thing was certain. The mystery was far from over, and whatever lay ahead, it would be worse than anything he could have imagined. Just before he stepped out into the cold night, he heard a faint sound, barely audible but unmistakable. The soft chime of a bell, ringing from somewhere in the distance. It wasn't a church bell. It wasn't the kind of sound one would expect in a town like this. No, this bell had a different tone, a tone that made Father Brown's skin crawl, and with that, the mystery took on a new dimension, one that would haunt him until the very end. Father Brown paused, a single thought flashing through his mind. I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 2. Father Brown knows who lied. It was the kind of lie that could destroy a life with a single breath. Except Father Brown knew it wasn't just a lie. It was a carefully crafted deception, so tangled in its own web that no one could untangle it. Not until now. As he stood in the heart of the small village, feeling the weight of the truth press against him like an unbearable pressure, he knew the lie had spread far beyond where it had first been spoken. The moment had come, and the consequences would ripple through every life that had ever touched this one. The village had always been quiet, predictable in its serenity, but lately things had changed. Secrets had been exposed, and the calm exterior of the community had begun to crack. And in the center of it all was a person everyone had trusted, one they would never suspect of lying. But Father Brown had seen through the mask, and now he knew what no one else did. The truth had a way of revealing itself, but it was never as clear as it seemed. Lies, like shadows, stretched farther than the light could reach. The lie in question was simple in its telling. A tragic accident, a terrible misunderstanding. But Father Brown wasn't one to believe in coincidences. He'd heard the stories, and he knew something didn't add up. The timing, the people involved, the details that were left unsaid, all of it led him to the same conclusion. Someone was hiding something, and that someone was trying to cover it up. But why? Father Brown moved through the village with a calm demeanor, speaking to anyone who might offer him a clue. The more he listened, the more he realized just how many people had been touched by the deception. What had started as a small, harmless lie had now affected the entire community. It was impossible to trust anyone's word anymore. Every conversation, every gesture, felt like it was wrapped in suspicion. Then came the first twist, the discovery that the key witness to the incident had been lying, not about the facts, but about something far more dangerous. Father Brown had seen the look in their eyes, the shift in their expression, the slight hesitation before they spoke. It was a dead giveaway. They were hiding something far darker than the lie they had told. It was one thing to lie about a small detail, but it was something else entirely to withhold the truth in a way that could ruin lives. Father Brown knew then that he had to dig deeper, to understand not just the lie, but the motive behind it. The more he unraveled, the more disturbing the truth became. Every clue he uncovered only led to more questions, more uncertainty. Each revelation felt like another thread being pulled loose from the fabric of the village's carefully constructed reality. And then it hit him, the revelation that would shatter everything. The key witness had been hiding something far more than just a simple omission. The accident that had sparked the whole chain of events? It wasn't an accident at all. It was orchestrated, carefully planned, with the intention of framing someone else for a crime they didn't commit. But who could have done such a thing? Who was behind the curtain, pulling the strings? As Father Brown stood in the middle of the room, the pieces began to fall into place. The lie wasn't just about what had happened, it was about covering up something far more sinister. The entire village had been manipulated, and they had no idea. They'd been living in a bubble of falsehoods, and it was about to burst. But just as Father Brown thought he had it figured out, a new piece of information was revealed, one that completely threw him off course. The person he had thought was behind it all, the one who had been so cleverly lying, wasn't the mastermind at all. It was someone else entirely, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. The truth, it seemed, was much more complicated than he had ever imagined. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that the mystery wasn't just about uncovering a lie. It was about unraveling the very fabric of trust that held the village together. The more he uncovered, the more people he realized had been complicit. Every truth he uncovered only led to more deception. Everyone had been lying. Everyone had been part of the game, whether they knew it or not. And then, as the mystery deepened, Father Brown faced the most shocking revelation yet. The one person who had been the closest to the victim, the one who had seemed the most innocent, had known all along. They had lied to protect someone else, someone they cared about deeply. But the question remained, who was this mysterious figure? And why were they willing to go to such lengths to protect them? The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Father Brown confronted the liar. The truth, as it always does, came spilling out, but it wasn't the clean, neat resolution he had hoped for. Instead, it was messy, chaotic, and far darker than he had ever imagined. There were no clear answers, no easy solutions. Everyone involved had their own motives, their own reasons for lying, and now it was all out in the open. But what was Father Brown supposed to do with this truth? Could he expose it all, or was it better to leave some secrets buried forever? As Father Brown stood there, the weight of the truth pressing down on him, he knew that the lies would never fully be untangled. Some things were better left unknown. But the damage had already been done. The web of deception had been woven too tightly, and now everyone in the village would have to live with the consequences. But Father Brown wasn't done yet. He still had one final question to answer. Who was the real liar, and why had they done it? The answer, as always, was far more complicated than he could have ever predicted. But that, he realized, was the true nature of the game. Chapter 3. He knelt before being shot. He knelt, eyes wide with terror, hands trembling, his last breath a desperate whisper to the cold night air. And then they shot him. In that moment, Father Brown knew this wasn't just murder. It was something far more sinister, a crime that could unravel everything they thought they knew about the man who had just died. No one saw it coming. No one suspected that someone so innocent, so seemingly unimportant, could become the center of such a horrifying tale. But now, as Father Brown stood over the body, the mystery deepened, twisting like a serpent, pulling him into a game where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The night had been quiet, too quiet. In the darkness, a lone figure had appeared, just a silhouette against the flickering street lamp. The victim, a young man with no real enemies, no enemies that anyone knew of, had been found in a back alley, kneeling in a pool of his own blood. The shot that had killed him wasn't from any common weapon. It was deliberate, calculated, and the position in which they'd found him was far too perfect. No struggle, no outburst, just the silence of an execution. Father Brown had been called to the scene, and as he looked down at the body, he felt something stir within him. Something cold, something heavy. He'd seen murders before, but this was different. The victim's hands were still clasped together as if in prayer, and the calm expression on his face was not that of someone who had been caught off guard. It was as if he had been waiting for it, accepting it. Who could have done this? Why was he shot? And why was he kneeling before his death, as though offering himself up like a sacrificial lamb? The answers were elusive, like smoke, slipping through Father Brown's grasp every time he thought he was getting close. There was something deeply unsettling about the whole thing, something that didn't make sense. The case seemed impossible to solve, the motives unclear. Father Brown spoke to the few witnesses who had been in the area, but their testimonies contradicted each other. Some claimed they had seen the victim speaking to a man in a dark coat moments before the shooting. Others said they hadn't heard anything at all, just the sudden crack of a gunshot in the distance. It wasn't adding up. Who could be so cold-blooded, so ruthless, that they would kill someone without reason, without warning? The victim had been a nobody, a simple worker who lived a quiet life. There was nothing to suggest that he had been involved in anything dangerous, nothing that could explain why someone would want him dead. Father Brown's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of the case. A missing piece, a whisper on the edge of his thoughts, kept him from seeing the full picture. But there was one thing that gnawed at him, a detail that everyone else had missed. The victim had been kneeling before he was shot. That couldn't have been by accident. There was intent behind that. It wasn't just a murder, it was a ritual. But who would go to such lengths, and why? As Father Brown delved deeper, he uncovered a web of lies and deceit that seemed to stretch across the entire village. Everyone was hiding something, and the deeper he went, the more the truth became tangled in a maze of conflicting stories. Some claimed the victim had been involved in shady dealings, while others insisted he was as clean as a whistle. But no matter how many people he spoke to, no matter how many hours he spent searching for the truth, there was always one thing that remained just out of reach: the true motive behind the murder. Then came the first shocking revelation. A witness, someone who had been too afraid to speak up before, came forward with new information. They had seen something: a woman standing just beyond the alley, watching the entire thing unfold. She hadn't said a word, hadn't moved, just stood there in the shadows, staring. The witness couldn't see her face, but they were sure she was the key to solving the mystery. Who was she? Why was she there? And most importantly, why hadn't she done anything to stop the shooting? Father Brown's instinct screamed that she knew more than she was letting on, and that the answer to the murder lay within her silence. But as the investigation continued, things only became more complicated. The woman in the shadows remained elusive, her identity a mystery. Every lead Father Brown followed seemed to dead end, and the more he learned about the victim's past, the more the case seemed to spiral into a labyrinth of lies. There were rumors of money, of debts owed to dangerous people. There were whispers of forbidden relationships, of secrets kept behind closed doors. But nothing connected. Nothing made sense. Father Brown stood in the alley late one evening, staring at the spot where the victim had fallen. He could feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on him. It was as if the case was mocking him, daring him to uncover the truth, yet withholding it just out of reach. There was a deeper darkness at play here, something that went beyond murder. It was about power, control, and the things people were willing to do to protect themselves. Then came the second bombshell, the discovery of the victim's diary, a small, worn leather book hidden away in his apartment. Inside, Father Brown found a series of cryptic entries, each one more disturbing than the last. The victim had been receiving threats, veiled warnings, not from one person, but from multiple sources. And one of those threats was signed with a symbol Father Brown recognized instantly. It was the same symbol he had seen on the wall of the church, the one that had appeared in the case of another long-forgotten crime. A symbol linked to an underground group, a secret society that operated in the shadows, manipulating events for their own gain. The victim had known something that had cost him his life. Father Brown's heart raced as he read the final entry in the diary. It was a message left for someone he didn't know. It was a confession, a final admission of guilt, but it was incomplete. The victim had been part of something much bigger than anyone had realized, and he had been caught in the crossfire. But what was it? What had he uncovered that had made him such a target? As Father Brown stood there, trying to make sense of the twisted puzzle before him, he heard a soft noise behind him. He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his collar, his mind racing. Could it be her? Could it be the woman in the shadows? But when he turned, there was no one there, only the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. Father Brown's mind spun. He had the pieces, but they didn't fit. The more he uncovered, the more the mystery deepened. Someone was playing a game, a deadly game, and he was being pulled into it with no way out. The truth was right there, just out of reach, but it was buried under layers of deception and fear. And then came the final twist, the revelation that shattered everything Father Brown thought he knew. The woman in the shadows, the one who had been watching, wasn't just a bystander. She was part of the plan. She was the one who had orchestrated the whole thing. The victim hadn't been kneeling to accept his fate. He had been kneeling to beg for his life. But it was too late. Father Brown stared into the darkness, his mind racing. He knew who had done it, but the question remained, why? What had motivated such a cold, calculated act of violence? And more importantly, would anyone ever truly understand the full extent of the web of lies, deceit, and manipulation that had led to that one fateful moment? The truth, it seemed, was not just hidden. It was buried deep within a darkness that no one was ready to face. Chapter 4. The cross vanished before dawn. The cross was gone before the first light of dawn, and with it, a piece of everyone's soul. It wasn't just a symbol of faith, it was a symbol of the past, a connection to something unspoken and eternal. But now it was missing, and with it, all the answers that had seemed so close just hours before. The town was waking up to a mystery it wasn't prepared for, and Father Brown was standing at the center, watching as everything he knew slowly crumbled into dust. It had started with a simple disappearance. The cross, a cherished relic in the small village church, had been placed in its usual spot the night before, on the altar, under the soft light of the candles. But when the first rays of sunlight had crept through the stained glass windows that morning, the cross was gone. No trace of it remained, no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away. Just an empty altar where the symbol of the town's faith had once stood. Father Brown was called to the scene immediately. The villagers, uneasy with the sudden disappearance, were already gathering outside the church, speaking in hushed tones. But there was something far darker at play here, something deeper than just a stolen artifact. As he stepped inside the church, the air felt different, thicker, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. The absence of the cross seemed to echo through the walls, like the silence that follows a great tragedy. He walked to the altar, his fingers brushing the cold stone. The church was still, too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Father Brown closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle over him. It wasn't just the cross that was gone. It was the trust, the faith, the belief in the sanctity of the place. Something had been violated, and someone in the town knew more than they were letting on. The church, with its age-old walls and sacred space, had seen its share of miracles, of secrets kept within the shadows, but now those secrets were spilling out, threatening to reveal something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Father Brown could feel the pull of it, the quiet whisper of a truth that lay just beyond his reach. He had been called to many cases before, but this was different. There was no simple explanation for what had happened. The cross hadn't just vanished, it had been taken. But who would dare steal such a sacred object, and why? The more Father Brown thought about it, the more the mystery deepened. The cross had been in the same place for as long as anyone could remember. No one had ever dared move it, let alone steal it. So why now? What had changed? What had made this particular theft so important? As Father Brown began to investigate, he spoke to the villagers who had been in the church the night before. One by one, they all claimed to have left before midnight. None had seen anything unusual. None had noticed anything out of place. Yet, the cross was gone. It didn't add up. Someone in the town knew something. But the question was, who? And why were they so eager to hide it? Father Brown's suspicions grew as he spoke to more people. There were whispers, rumors that had been circulating for months, maybe years. The church, once a place of solace, had become the focal point of something darker. Some spoke of hidden secrets, of ancient curses buried deep in the town's history. Others spoke of power struggles, of people willing to do anything to gain control. The cross had always been more than just a symbol of faith. It was a key, a piece of something much larger. But what? Then came the first big reveal, the piece of information that would shatter everything. A young woman who had been working at the church for years came forward. She had seen something the night before, something no one else had noticed. She had seen a figure, cloaked in shadow, standing at the altar long after the church had emptied. The figure had been holding the cross, staring at it as if it held the answers to questions only they could understand. The woman hadn't thought much of it at the time. She had assumed it was just a late-night visitor, maybe someone seeking solace. But now, in the light of the morning, she realized the figure had been far more than that. They had been there for a reason. They had taken the cross, and no one had seen them leave. The woman's story sent a chill down Father Brown's spine. The cross wasn't just stolen, it had been chosen. Someone had wanted it, needed it, for something far more significant than anyone could imagine. But why? What was the true power of this cross, and why had this figure gone to such lengths to take it? The mystery deepened with every passing hour. Father Brown continued his investigation, following the trail of clues that seemed to lead him in every direction. There were signs of tampering, hidden messages left in plain sight. It was as if someone was toying with him, leading him on a path that never seemed to end. Every time he thought he was close to the truth, something new would surface, throwing everything into chaos. Father Brown's mind raced as he pieced together the clues. The cross had always been more than just a religious symbol. It had been a key to something hidden beneath the surface. But what? The answer was still eluding him, slipping through his fingers like water. And then as he dug deeper, he uncovered something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The cross wasn't just a symbol of faith. It was a symbol of power, a link to something ancient, something that had been buried for generations. The town's history was riddled with secrets, and the cross was the key to unlocking them all. But the more Father Brown uncovered, the more he realized that there were people in the town who would stop at nothing to keep those secrets buried. The truth was dangerous, and there were those who would kill to protect it. As Father Brown continued his investigation, he found himself drawn into a web of deceit and manipulation. The town was a tinderbox, ready to explode at any moment. The cross was just the beginning. Whatever had been set in motion with its theft could not be undone. The town's dark history had been awakened, and now Father Brown was the only one who could stop it. But just as the pieces seemed to fall into place, a new twist was revealed. A letter delivered to Father Brown in secret contained a warning. Someone in the village knew the truth, but they were not ready to tell it. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was from someone who had been involved in the events long before Father Brown had ever arrived. The warning was clear. The cross was never meant to be found, and now that it had been taken, nothing would stop the darkness from consuming everything. Father Brown stood in the silence of the church, staring at the empty altar. The weight of the mystery pressed down on him like a vice. The cross was gone, and with it, the last remnants of a past that had been carefully hidden for so long. The town's secrets were now exposed, but the truth was still out of reach. And as Father Brown turned to leave the church, A single thought echoed in his mind. The truth is out there, but it will never be fully revealed. Some things are better left in the dark. Do you like this personality? Chapter 5. She prayed before she killed. She prayed before she killed him. No one would believe it, but Father Brown saw the truth in her eyes, the truth that even she didn't understand yet. It wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a moment of madness. It was something far darker, something that reached deep into the soul. And in that prayer, in that last moment before the life left his body, she had sealed her own fate. The question was no longer who killed him, but why she had to pray first. The small village had been gripped with shock. A beloved woman, known for her kindness and faith, had been arrested for murder. The victim, a local priest, had been found in the rectory, his life taken in a way that suggested a cold, calculated hand. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, just a quiet death, as if the man had welcomed it. But what no one could explain was the woman who had done it. She had been seen praying in the church just hours before, kneeling in the same spot where she had confessed her sins, seeking forgiveness. And yet, in that moment, she had taken the life of a man she claimed to love. Father Brown stood in front of the church, his mind racing. There were no answers, only more questions. How could this woman, so devoted to her faith, commit such an act of violence? And why had she done it? The priest had been a friend to her. They had shared many quiet moments, talking of faith and forgiveness. But now, all of that was cast into doubt. Was it truly an act of blind rage, or was there something deeper at play? As Father Brown entered the church, the silence was overwhelming. The air hung heavy with the weight of unanswered questions, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to emerge. He spoke to the woman's closest friends, her family, the people who had seen her every day. None could make sense of what had happened. All they knew was that she had changed in the weeks leading up to the murder. She had become distant, lost in thought, as though something was eating away at her from the inside. The mystery began to take shape, but it was still unclear. Father Brown knew that this was no ordinary case. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something that was driving this woman to the edge. The way she had prayed before killing him, like she was asking for forgiveness before committing the ultimate sin, spoke to something deeper, something spiritual. But what could it be? What had driven her to do something so unthinkable? Father Brown turned his attention to the priest's past, hoping to find something that could explain the events. The priest had been well liked, a man of integrity, but there were whispers that had been floating around the village for years, but no one had dared to voice them aloud. The priest had a secret, something dark that he had kept hidden from everyone, even from the woman who had murdered him. A secret so dark that it could destroy everything. Father Brown dug deeper into the priest's life, speaking to those who had known him best. He uncovered a series of letters the priest had written to someone Father Brown had never heard of. The letters were filled with cryptic messages, vague references to debts that couldn't be paid, and promises that couldn't be kept. As Father Brown read them, a sickening realization began to settle in. The priest had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone had suspected. He had been tied to a network of people who were dangerous, people who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. But the most disturbing part was the connection between the woman and the priest. Father Brown pieced together fragments of conversations, subtle hints that she had known about the priest's secret life. In her prayers, she had confessed to knowing things about him that no one else did. She had begged for forgiveness, not for something she had done, but for something she was about to do. She had been driven by guilt, by fear, by the need to stop something that had spiraled out of control. The more Father Brown uncovered, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The woman had been trapped in a web of lies, manipulated by someone who had known her weakness. The priest's secret was far worse than anyone had imagined, and it had been passed on to her in a twisted, cruel way. She had killed him, but she hadn't done it out of malice. She had done it to stop something far worse from happening. Then came the first big revelation. Father Brown discovered a hidden room in the church, a room that had been locked for years. Inside, he found evidence of a dark ritual, one that had been performed by the priest and the woman together. It was a ritual meant to bind them to a force that was beyond their control, a force that had slowly consumed both of them over time. The priest had become a vessel for something evil, and the woman had been the only one who could stop it. But to stop it, she had to kill him. She had prayed for forgiveness, but she had also known that it was the only way to free them both from the darkness that had taken hold. Father Brown's heart raced as he pieced together the final parts of the mystery. The woman had been a victim, just as much as the priest. She had been forced into a corner, driven to do something that went against everything she had believed in. The murder wasn't just about revenge, it was about survival. The woman had done it to protect the village, to protect herself, and to stop a greater evil from taking root. But the question remained, had she truly stopped it, or had she unwittingly unleashed something far worse? As Father Brown stood there, staring at the altar, he felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The woman had prayed before she killed him, but now Father Brown wasn't sure if she had truly freed them. The darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface was far from gone. It was still there, waiting, watching, biding its time. Father Brown knew that the answers were within reach, but the truth was too dangerous to reveal. Some secrets, no matter how dark, were better left untouched. The woman had prayed before she killed, but she had unknowingly set into motion something that could never be undone. As he walked away from the church, he couldn't shake the feeling that the true mystery was still out there, just beyond his grasp. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences of that revelation would haunt the village for years to come. The last words he spoke echoed in the cold night air. I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 6. Confession. Came too late. Tonight. She walked in with the blood of her secrets on her hands, but by the time she spoke, it was already too late. The confession she had been holding for so long came tumbling out in a voice that was barely a whisper. But in that moment, Father Brown knew something deeper, darker, had been hidden for far too long. It wasn't the confession that shocked him. It was the realization that the truth had already been buried under layers of lies. And now, with the confession too late, nothing would ever be the same again. The night had already been strange. The air had a chill to it that couldn't be explained, and the village had been quiet, too quiet for comfort. Father Brown had received the message at dusk. A strange letter slipped under his door with no return address. The words were cryptic, full of dread, and the request was simple. Come to the church immediately. Someone needed to confess. But who? And for what? Father Brown wasn't sure, but he knew that when a confession came so urgently, there was more to it than met the eye. When he arrived, the church was dark, save for the flickering candlelight that illuminated the altar. There, kneeling, was a figure, barely visible in the shadows. Father Brown approached slowly, his heart beating faster with every step. It was her, the woman everyone had trusted, the one whose name had been whispered among the villagers in recent days. Her reputation had once been spotless, but now it was becoming clear that the facade had cracked. She didn't look up when he approached. She didn't even move. Father Brown stood still for a moment, watching her, waiting for the words to come. What could she possibly have to confess that required such urgency? The silence in the church was deafening, and for a moment it felt as if the air itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable truth to be spoken. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, but each word carried the weight of years of guilt. "I did it," she whispered. "I killed him, but not for the reasons you think." The confession came with such finality, such pain, that Father Brown felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just about a murder. It was about something much deeper, something that had been festering for too long. But what was the truth she was hiding? Father Brown took a step closer, his mind racing. He had been called to many confessions, but this one felt different. There was a hidden truth here, one that went beyond the murder. She had killed someone close, someone she had once loved. But why? And why had she waited so long to confess? As he knelt beside her, Father Brown began to piece together the fragments of the story she had started to tell. The victim had been someone who had been in her life for years, an old friend, a confidant. But something had changed between them. There was tension, resentment that had built up over time. But the true motive behind the murder was still unclear. Father Brown listened as she spoke of her struggles, her fears, but it wasn't until she spoke of the event itself that the true darkness began to emerge. "The night he died, I was lost," she continued. "I didn't know what I was doing. I thought it was the only way to escape, the only way to stop him from controlling me, from manipulating everything." She paused, as if the weight of her own words was too much to bear. Father Brown's heart pounded in his chest. There was something so twisted in her voice, so broken in her confession, that he knew this was no ordinary crime. She wasn't just confessing to murder. She was confessing to a lifetime of lies, a life built on deception and fear. But as she continued, the story took another turn, one that shook Father Brown to his core. The victim, it turned out, hadn't been the person he seemed. He had been hiding something terrible. He had manipulated her, controlled her every move until she was nothing more than a puppet in his hands. And the worst part? She had known it. She had known, and she had allowed it. The guilt she had carried for all these years was not just for taking a life, but for being complicit in something far more sinister. The first big reveal came as she spoke of the secret she had buried so deep within herself, one she had never shared with anyone, not even him. The victim had been involved in something criminal, something that could destroy everything. The truth of his actions had been hidden behind a mask of respectability, but Father Brown knew that no one could hide forever. The man had been a monster, pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating everyone around him for his own gain. And she, in her desperation, had finally snapped. Father Brown stood in silence, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a confession, it was the unraveling of a life filled with dark secrets and unspoken truths. The woman in front of him had been trapped in a web of lies, just as much a victim as the man she had killed. But now, as the confession came too late, Father Brown realized that the full truth would never be revealed. The pieces of the puzzle were still missing, and the more he uncovered, the more questions arose. Just when Father Brown thought he had reached the end of the story, another twist came. The woman's confession was not just about the murder, it was about something else entirely. She spoke of an ancient curse, a curse that had been passed down through generations, one that had bound her to the victim in a way she couldn't explain. The more she spoke, the more Father Brown realized that the murder wasn't the beginning of the story, it was the end. As the confession continued, it became clear that the woman had been part of something much bigger, something that no one had ever suspected. The victim's death wasn't just an act of vengeance, it was the culmination of a dark pact, one that had been made long before either of them had been born. The murder was just the final piece of the puzzle, and now that it had been revealed, there was no turning back. The room grew colder as Father Brown processed the weight of her words. The mystery had deepened, and the truth seemed more elusive than ever. Who had truly controlled the events that led to the murder? What had the victim been hiding? And what did the woman's confession mean for the village? The tension in the air was palpable, and Father Brown knew that the answers were slipping away, just out of reach. The confession had come too late, and with it, the finality of the truth seemed inevitable. But just as he was about to speak, to offer his understanding, the woman's face twisted in fear. "It's not over," she whispered. "They'll come for you next." Father Brown froze, the implications of her words settling into the pit of his stomach. What had she meant? Who would come for him, and why? As Father Brown stood there, the weight of the mystery pressing down on him, he realized that the confession had only opened more doors, doors that would never be closed again. The answers were out there, but they were buried deep beneath layers of darkness, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. And as Father Brown left the church that night, he knew one thing for certain. The truth had come too late, but it was far from over. "I know who did it," he said to himself, "but the truth will never be told." Chapter 7. Murderer hid behind the pulpit. The murderer was hiding right there, behind the pulpit, his shadow watching as the town prayed, his hands stained with the blood of a man he had killed just hours before. No one had noticed, no one had suspected a thing, but Father Brown knew the truth. The evil that had plagued this small village was closer than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't a stranger, an outsider, or an intruder. It was someone who belonged here, someone who had been among them. All along, someone who had blended in so seamlessly that they could hide in plain sight. But now, with the truth just barely coming into view, nothing would ever be the same again. It had started with the death of the town's beloved rector. He was found in his study, a knife buried in his back, the only clue a torn letter that seemed to be from someone close, someone trusted. The initial investigation led nowhere. The villagers were in shock, unable to comprehend who could do such a thing. No one had a clear answer, and Father Brown knew something more sinister was at play. What made this murder so chilling wasn't just the crime itself, but the silence that followed. The silence of those who should have been speaking but remained eerily quiet. The murder wasn't random. It was calculated, It wasn't just an attack on one man. It was a betrayal of everything that held this community together. The rector had been a symbol of peace, someone who had offered comfort and guidance to the villagers, yet the darkness that hid behind the walls of the church had grown too strong for even him to escape. But who could have done this? Who could kill such a man with no apparent motive, no apparent reason? The only clue was the letter. It was hastily written, with cryptic words, hinting at a secret that could unravel everything. But what was the secret, and why had it been hidden? Father Brown stood in the dimly lit church, staring at the pulpit. He had already pieced together some of the puzzle. The rector had been more than just a man of faith. He had been hiding something that had cost him his life. But the deeper Father Brown dug, the more he realized that the truth wasn't as simple as it seemed. Every lead pointed in a different direction. Every witness had their own story to tell, and no one seemed to know who was involved. The silence was suffocating, and the more Father Brown learned, the more confused he became. It was like a veil had been placed over the truth, and every step he took only seemed to take him further into the fog. The first big breakthrough came when Father Brown spoke with the rector's closest confidant, a young man who had served as his assistant for years. His name was Thomas, and he had been with the rector the night before the murder. But when Father Brown pressed him for details, he found himself stumbling, his story full of holes. There was fear in his eyes, fear of something. But what? What had Thomas seen? What did he know? Father Brown had a sense that Thomas was hiding something. His nervousness, his hesitance to speak, was a sign that something deeper was at play. But when Father Brown confronted him, Thomas admitted something chilling. The rector had been terrified. For weeks, the rector had been acting strangely, withdrawn, almost paranoid. He had spoken of a threat he couldn't name, something or someone who was coming for him. And just before his death, the rector had written a letter, only a few words, but enough to make anyone question everything they thought they knew. "I know who you are," the letter had said, the one behind the pulpit. Father Brown's heart sank as he read those words in his mind. The pulpit, the very place where the rector had stood every Sunday, offering words of wisdom and comfort. The pulpit, where he had delivered countless sermons, was now a symbol of something far more sinister. But what did the rector mean? Who was hiding behind it? And how did it tie into the murder? As Father Brown searched for answers, the mystery grew even darker. The villagers whispered of things that didn't make sense. Strange meetings in the dead of night, secret conversations in the shadows, and hidden messages that no one could decipher. The more Father Brown dug, the more he uncovered about the rector's past, his connections, his dealings, the people he had known before he came to the village. The rector had been a man of secrets, and those secrets were now slowly coming to light. But each revelation only led to more questions. And then came the most shocking piece of information. Father Brown discovered that the rector's closest ally, the one person who had been by his side through thick and thin, was not who he seemed. The man had been hiding a secret, a dark secret that tied him directly to the murder. He had been involved in a scheme that had spiraled out of control, a scheme that had led to betrayal and ultimately to the rector's death. But it wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a calculated move, part of a larger plan to silence someone who knew too much. But why? What was the rector about to reveal that could cost him his life? Father Brown's mind raced as he pieced together the final pieces of the puzzle. The rector had been hiding the truth, but not just from the villagers. He had been hiding it from someone much closer, someone who had been pulling the strings from behind the pulpit, manipulating the people in the church and orchestrating the murder that had taken place. The truth, it seemed, was much darker than Father Brown had ever anticipated. The rector had been killed, not just for what he knew, but for what he was about to reveal. As Father Brown stood in the church, the final pieces of the mystery clicked into place. He turned to the pulpit, his mind reeling from everything he had uncovered. The murderer hadn't just hidden behind the pulpit. They had been using it as a cover for something much more dangerous. The pulpit was a symbol of power, a place where truth could be twisted and used for manipulation. The person who had hidden behind it had been using the church as a shield, hiding their actions from everyone around them, playing the role of the trusted leader while secretly plotting the murder that would ensure their control. The question remained, who was the murderer? Father Brown had his suspicions, but the truth was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The person behind the pulpit was someone who had been hiding in plain sight, someone whose true nature had been concealed by the trust the village had placed in them. The mystery wasn't just about the murder. It was about the lies, the secrets, and the manipulation that had been happening right under everyone's noses. And as Father Brown prepared to confront the murderer, he knew one thing for certain: the truth would never be the same again. The secrets that had been buried behind the pulpit were now exposed. But the consequences of those revelations were far from over. The mystery was far from finished. And as Father Brown walked away from the church, he could already feel the darkness following him, waiting for its next move. "I know who did it," Father Brown said quietly to himself, his voice barely a whisper. "But the truth will never be told." Chapter 8. The sacristy held a secret. The secret was hidden in the sacristy, buried beneath centuries of dust, concealed in the shadows where no one dared to look. But someone had found it. Someone had uncovered the truth. And now it was only a matter of time before the entire village unraveled in the wake of what they would learn. What lay behind the sacred doors of the sacristy wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was the key to everything, a dark truth that no one could ever have imagined. And now, as Father Brown stepped inside, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The sacristy had always been a place of reverence, a quiet room where the sacred rituals of the church were prepared and the secrets of faith were kept. But there was always something unsettling about it, something that made Father Brown's instincts stir whenever he passed by. It wasn't just the stillness, the coldness of the stone walls. It was the feeling that something was being hidden there, something far more important than anyone could have imagined. When the letter had arrived, it had been addressed to Father Brown in an anonymous hand. The message was simple but urgent. "The sacristy holds a secret that must never be uncovered, but it's already too late." At first, Father Brown had thought little of it, just another cryptic note, another mystery to ponder. But then, late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Father Brown found himself standing at the entrance to the sacristy, his hand hovering over the door. He had been warned, but the curiosity was too much to resist. Something was calling to him, beckoning him to open the door and look inside. What he found was beyond anything he could have expected. The room was as he remembered it, dimly lit, filled with the scent of incense and old wood. But as he stepped further inside, something caught his eye. The altar, usually pristine and untouched, was scattered with old yellowed papers, fragments of something long forgotten. At the far end of the room, beneath the altar, was a hidden trap door. Father Brown had never noticed it before, and he couldn't help but wonder why it had been concealed for so long. What lay beneath? The mystery deepened as Father Brown cautiously approached the trap door. It creaked open with an eerie sound, and he was hit with a rush of cold air as he descended into the darkness below. The passageway was narrow, winding, and lined with stone that had been untouched for centuries. As he moved deeper into the darkness, Father Brown's mind raced. What could be hidden here? What had been buried away for so long? At the end of the passage, Father Brown found a small, forgotten chamber. The walls were lined with ancient books, some of which appeared to be handwritten, their ink faded by time. In the center of the room lay a stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. But it wasn't the altar that caught Father Brown's attention. It was the object that sat on top of it, concealed beneath a cloth. With trembling hands, he lifted the cloth to reveal a small, intricately carved box. It was old, older than anything Father Brown had ever seen, and its surface was covered in strange symbols, symbols that seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain. As Father Brown examined the box, he felt a chill run down his spine. There was something not right about it, something that made his skin crawl. He opened the box, and inside, nestled in velvet, was a single key. It was made of silver, its shape unlike any key he had ever seen before. The key was beautiful, yet haunting, its edges sharp and precise. But what could it open? And why had it been hidden away for so long? Suddenly, the air seemed to shift around him. The temperature dropped, and a whispering wind began to circulate through the chamber. Father Brown's heart raced as he realized that he was no longer alone. Someone was watching him from the shadows, waiting for him to uncover the truth. But what truth? What had been kept hidden here, in the dark, for so many years? He quickly pocketed the key, deciding that he would need to return to the surface and think carefully before moving forward. But as he reached for the trapdoor, he noticed something strange on the wall, a series of scratched markings, as if someone had tried to erase them. Upon closer inspection, he realized they were dates. But what did they mean? Father Brown's mind raced. Were they significant? Could they be connected to the mysterious box? And more importantly, what did they tell him about the secret that had been buried in the sacristy? When Father Brown emerged back into the church, he was no longer the same man who had entered the sacristy. The weight of what he had discovered pressed heavily on him, and the questions that swirled in his mind seemed endless. The sacristy held a secret, yes. But what was it? And why had it been kept hidden for so long? The more Father Brown thought about it, the more he realized that the answers might be far darker than he could ever have imagined. He began to investigate further, speaking to the townspeople, digging into the church's history, and searching for anything that could provide context to the markings he had found. It wasn't long before he discovered something that made his blood run cold. The box had once belonged to a man who had lived in the village centuries ago, a man who had been involved in a dark and twisted religious order. The order had practiced forbidden rituals, seeking to harness powers that no one was meant to control. And as Father Brown dug deeper into the history, he uncovered something truly horrifying. The order had been involved in the murder of several innocent people, all in the name of their dark beliefs. But there was more. Father Brown uncovered evidence suggesting that the secret hidden beneath the sacristy had been tied to a mysterious prophecy, one that had been passed down through generations, one that spoke of a power so great it could change the world. The prophecy was clear. Whoever unlocked the secret of the sacristy would gain unimaginable power, but at a great cost. The price would be the soul, and the person who unlocked it would be forever bound to the forces they had unleashed. Father Brown could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. The more he uncovered, the more he realized how dangerous this truth was. Whoever had hidden the key in the sacristy had done so for a reason. They didn't want the power to be unleashed. But now, the key was in his possession, and Father Brown knew that he had to make a choice: keep searching for the truth, or destroy the key and bury the secret once and for all. But as he wrestled with his decision, another revelation came to light, one that changed everything. The symbols on the box weren't just random markings. They were a map, a guide to where the next piece of the puzzle lay. And the key wasn't just for the box, it was for something much greater, something that Father Brown had only begun to understand. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Father Brown realized that he had no choice but to continue the search. The sacristy held a secret, and now that secret was calling to him, pulling him deeper into a mystery that was far darker than anything he could have imagined. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized that the truth might be too much to handle. "I know what it is," Father Brown whispered to himself, "but I'm not sure I want to know any more." And as he walked away from the church, the shadow of the secret following him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was too late, that the forces he had uncovered were already in motion, and there was no stopping them now. The truth was out there, waiting. But was it too late to stop the damage that had already been done? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Father Brown had uncovered something far beyond his control, and now the consequences would be unimaginable. Chapter 9. She was buried with guilt. She was buried with guilt, her coffin sealed tight not only by earth, but by the sins that would never be forgiven. The town stood in silence as the grave was lowered, unaware that the real story had only just begun. Beneath the surface, secrets festered like a wound that had been hidden too long. And as the last of the dirt fell over her final resting place, Father Brown knew the truth. The guilt that had been buried with her was only the beginning of a much darker tale. The more he dug, the more twisted and complex the mystery became, and the line between innocence and guilt blurred beyond recognition. The funeral had been a somber affair. The woman, once a respected member of the village, had died under mysterious circumstances. No one had expected it, and no one had understood it. She had lived a life of quiet humility, always helping others, always doing the right thing. But when she was found dead in her home, the cause was shrouded in suspicion. Was it suicide? Was it murder? Or was it something even darker, something that no one dared speak of? Father Brown had arrived at the scene, his mind already racing with questions. He had known the woman, had spoken to her on numerous occasions, and yet something about her death didn't sit right with him. There was no sign of struggle, no obvious trauma, just a lifeless body, and a note left behind that had more questions than answers. The note was cryptic, almost poetic, with words that seemed to hint at something far deeper. The sins of the past never die. They are buried with the soul, and the soul is mine now. The words haunted Father Brown, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. What had this woman been hiding? What was so terrible that it would drive her to write such a message in her final moments. The deeper Father Brown dug into her life, the more unsettling the revelations became. He spoke to the people she had known, the friends she had kept. But each conversation seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Everyone spoke highly of her, praised her kindness, her generosity, but no one truly knew her. No one knew the secrets she had buried so deep, not even the ones closest to her. The mystery surrounding her death seemed to grow with every step Father Brown took. The town had its theories, of course. Some believed it was a simple case of guilt, of a woman who had finally succumbed to the weight of her own conscience. Others whispered that it was something more, something connected to a dark past, a past that had been buried with her. But what was the truth? Father Brown turned his attention to the most unlikely of places, the church. It was here that he found his first real lead. The church had always been a place of solace for the woman, a sanctuary where she had spent countless hours in prayer. But there was something off about the way she had been seen at the church in the days leading up to her death. Father Brown spoke to the parish priest, who revealed something that sent a chill through his spine. The woman had been acting strangely. She had visited the church at odd hours, praying alone in the middle of the night. She had seemed frantic, as if something was chasing her, something she couldn't escape. But the priest had noticed something else, a symbol, one that had been carved into the wooden pews near the altar. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, an old, forgotten symbol that had been used in the ancient rituals of the village, rituals that had long been abandoned, locked away in the church's darkest corners. The revelation was enough to make Father Brown's pulse quicken. The symbol was tied to something much older than the woman, something far darker. It was a symbol of guilt, of remorse, of a soul bound to a fate it could never escape. The woman had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. But what had she done? And why had she chosen to carry this burden, in silence, alone? As Father Brown pieced together the fragments of the mystery, he discovered something truly shocking. The woman had been part of a secret order, a group of individuals who had sworn to protect the town's darkest secrets, secrets that had been hidden for centuries. The order's true purpose was never known to the villagers, but their influence had been felt in every corner of the town. They had operated in the shadows, manipulating events, controlling the flow of history. And now, with the woman's death, the order had been exposed. But the most terrifying revelation came when Father Brown uncovered the order's true nature. They were not just protectors of secrets, they were keepers of guilt. Each member of the order had been chosen to carry a terrible burden, a burden that they could never escape. The woman had been no exception. She had been chosen to bear the guilt of something terrible, something that could never be forgiven. But what was it? What had she done that had made her soul so irredeemable? As Father Brown delved deeper into the order's history, he found something that made his blood run cold, a record of a ritual that had been performed on the night of the woman's death. It was a ritual of atonement, designed to purge the soul of its guilt. But it came at a cost. The ritual required a sacrifice. A life must be taken, and the soul of the one who performed the ritual must be bound to the darkness forever. The woman had known what was coming. She had known that the ritual would demand her soul, that it would require her to make the ultimate sacrifice, and she had done it willingly. But the true horror of the ritual was that it hadn't worked. The guilt had not been purged. Instead, It had been passed on, passed to someone else, someone who would carry it for the rest of their life. Father Brown realized the terrible truth. Her death had not been the end. It had only been the beginning. The guilt she had carried, the burden she had borne, had not died with her. It had been transferred, passed on to someone else, someone who would now bear the weight of her sins. But who? And how would they ever escape it? As Father Brown confronted the villagers, asking them about the secret order, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The people who had been closest to the woman, those who had known her best, were beginning to act strangely. Some were withdrawing. Others were becoming agitated. It was as if the guilt was spreading, infecting everyone who had been involved in the woman's life. The darkness was taking hold, and Father Brown realized that the town was in danger. Danger of being consumed by the same guilt that had haunted the woman. But there was no way to stop it. The order's influence was too strong, too deeply rooted in the village's history. The woman's death had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. The guilt would spread, and there was nothing Father Brown could do to stop it. And as he stood there, watching the town begin to unravel, Father Brown realized that the truth had already been buried. The guilt had been passed on, but the price had been too high. And now, as the darkness closed in, the only thing left to do was to walk away. Some secrets he knew were better left untold. "I know who did it," Father Brown said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had uncovered. "But the truth will never be told." Chapter 10. Last Prayer Echoed Through Blood. The last prayer she whispered was drowned out by the sound of blood spilling, a chilling echo that resonated far beyond the walls of the chapel. She had asked for forgiveness, but no one would hear her plea, not before it was too late. And as Father Brown stepped into the room where she died, the question that haunted him was not who killed her, but why the prayer had been spoken at all. The answer would turn everything he knew upside down, and once it was uncovered, there would be no going back. The church, once a place of peace, was now a sanctuary, tainted by the stain of her death. The woman had been a figure of grace, someone who had lived a life of devotion, a life that the village had come to respect. Her death was as shocking as it was brutal, and the only clue that remained was the blood-soaked floor beneath the altar where she had fallen. But the most perplexing detail was the prayer. She had knelt, a single word escaping her lips as the life drained from her. Why? Why pray when death was inevitable? And why, of all places, was she found in the sacred heart of the church? Father Brown had been called to the scene, and the moment he stepped into the dimly lit chapel, he could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. The air was thick with tension, and something about the place felt wrong, too wrong. The candles flickered as though afraid to burn too brightly, casting long, distorted shadows across the altar. As he approached the body, he saw that the woman's face held no fear, no shock, only peace. Her eyes were closed as though she had accepted what was to come. But what had she been accepting? And what had she known that no one else did? As Father Brown began his investigation, the townspeople spoke in hushed tones. They all knew her, of course. They had all seen her walk the streets, always smiling, always kind. To them, she had been a symbol of purity, a living embodiment of faith. But behind the whispers, Father Brown heard something else. He heard fear. There was something about her death that unsettled everyone, something that made the air feel colder than it should have been. No one could understand it, No one could explain why a woman who had been so beloved, so revered, would die in such a violent way. The victim's hands were still clasped in prayer, and a small, worn Bible lay beside her, as though she had tried to protect herself with the only weapon she had left. But it wasn't the violence of her death that unnerved Father Brown. It was the prayer, the whisper that had come from her lips just before she succumbed to the fatal wound. The deeper Father Brown dug, the more disturbing the truth became. The woman had not been killed by chance. She had been the target of something far more insidious, something that was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Father Brown spoke to the few who had been closest to her, trying to understand what had led to this moment. What could possibly have pushed her to this point of vulnerability? What had she known that no one else did? The first big reveal came when Father Brown spoke to the woman's closest friend, a fellow member of the church who had known her for years. She was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she spoke. "She knew," the friend whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. "She knew something she was never meant to know. It's why they came for her. It's why they killed her." Father Brown's mind raced as he tried to process what he had just heard. Who were they, and what had she known? The answer seemed just out of reach, like a shadow slipping away whenever he thought he had it cornered. But the friend's words stuck with him, gnawing at him. The woman had known something, and whatever it was the key to understanding why she had been killed. The investigation took Father Brown to the church's records, a dusty, neglected stack of ledgers and papers that had been left untouched for years. As he sifted through the pages, something caught his eye. A name, one that seemed strangely familiar. The name was linked to an ancient family in the town, a family whose wealth and power had long been whispered about in hushed tones. The family had been influential in the church's early years, its patriarch a prominent figure in the village's founding. But as Father Brown dug deeper into their history, he uncovered a series of dark secrets that had been buried for generations. The most shocking revelation came when Father Brown discovered a letter hidden among the records. It was dated years ago, long before the woman's death, and written by someone in the family. The letter spoke of a pact, an agreement between the family and the church, sealed in blood, a pact that would ensure the family's control over the village for generations. The woman, it seemed, had been caught in the web of this dark legacy. She had uncovered the truth about the pact, and in doing so, had become a threat to those who had hidden it for so long. Her death had been a means to silence her, to ensure that no one would ever uncover what had been buried. But even with this new information, the mystery only deepened. The woman's death was no accident. It was the result of a carefully orchestrated plan, one that had been set in motion long before she ever stepped foot in the church. Someone had been watching her, manipulating her, leading her down a path she couldn't escape. But who was the mastermind behind it all? And why had the woman been chosen to carry this terrible secret? As Father Brown continued his investigation, he found himself drawn deeper into the tangled web of lies and betrayal that had plagued the town for centuries. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the murder was just the beginning. The death of the woman had uncovered something far darker, something that no one had dared speak of until now. The church, the very institution that was supposed to offer refuge and redemption, had been complicit in a centuries-old conspiracy, and the truth had been buried beneath its sacred walls. But there was more to the story, something Father Brown could not yet understand. The last prayer, the one that had echoed through the blood, was not just a plea for forgiveness. It was a warning to someone who had been complicit in the crimes that had been committed. But the question remained, who and why had she prayed before she died? What had she known that could change everything? The final piece of the puzzle came when Father Brown received an anonymous letter. It was short, but it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. "The truth is already buried," it read. "The blood will never wash it away, and those who seek it will never find peace." Father Brown's heart sank. The mystery had reached its boiling point, but the truth was still slipping through his fingers, just out of reach. The woman's death had set something in motion, something far bigger than anyone could have ever imagined. The truth was out there, but it was buried in blood and secrets, and no one was willing to face it. "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered to himself, his voice thick with the weight of the mystery. "But the truth will never be told." And as he walked away from the church, he knew that the darkness would continue to haunt the village, that the secrets would remain buried, and that the echoes of her last prayer would never truly fade. Chapter 11. The killer's rosary was missing. The rosary was missing, and with it, the last piece of the puzzle, the final clue that could unravel everything or condemn them all. The killer had taken it, the one thing that tied them directly to the crime, and now it was gone. No one could explain why it had disappeared, or why its absence was so chilling. But Father Brown knew one thing. The missing rosary meant more than just a forgotten object. It was a symbol of guilt, a twisted reminder of something far darker. And now, the killer had left behind more than just a body. They had left a trail that could not be erased. The murder itself had been horrific, yet it was the details surrounding the crime that made it impossible to ignore. A beloved priest, found dead in his study, a deep wound to his chest, no signs of struggle. It seemed like a random act of violence, but nothing was ever truly random in Father Brown's world. As he surveyed the scene, something didn't sit right. The silence in the room was deafening, the stillness unsettling. The only clue, a rosary that had been carelessly tossed aside on the desk, its beads still warm from the touch of the victim's hand. But there was one problem. When Father Brown returned to the scene, the rosary was gone. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a coincidence. After all, the room had been cleaned up, the evidence neatly removed by the police. But Father Brown couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why would the rosary, such a significant object, just vanish? What was the significance of it being taken? He couldn't help but feel as though the missing rosary was the key to unlocking the entire mystery. The more Father Brown dug, the deeper the mystery became. Everyone in the village had their suspicions, their theories about the crime. Some believed it was a random attack, a robbery gone wrong. Others thought it was a personal vendetta. But Father Brown's instincts told him it was something else entirely. There was something personal about this murder, something that went far beyond a simple act of violence. The rosary wasn't just a religious symbol, it was a marker, a symbol of something far darker. But what, and why had it been taken? As Father Brown investigated further, he began to uncover a series of unsettling facts about the priest's life. The man was well loved by his congregation, but he had always been something of an enigma. Behind his gentle demeanor, there were whispers of secrets, things he had kept hidden, things that no one could explain. Was there something the priest had been hiding? Had he known too much? Had he gotten too close to something dangerous? Father Brown's questions led him to the most unlikely of places, the parishioner's confessional. The priest had spent hours each week behind that closed door, listening to the confessions of those who came seeking absolution. But who exactly had been confessing? And what had they been confessing to? It was when Father Brown spoke to the priest's closest confidant, a woman named Margaret, that things began to unravel. Margaret had been the priest's right hand, his closest ally, and yet even she had no answers. She had been present during many of the priest's confessions, but what she revealed was a chilling truth. The priest had been keeping a secret, one that involved a group of individuals in the town who had been part of a much larger conspiracy, one that involved the church and something far more dangerous. The rosary, it seemed, was not just a symbol of faith. It was part of something much darker. The first big reveal came when Father Brown uncovered a hidden ledger in the priest's personal effects. It was a record of transactions, secret meetings, and strange symbols, symbols that matched the ones he had seen etched into the walls of the church. The priest had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. He had been part of an underground order, one that had been operating in the shadows for decades, manipulating events to their advantage. The rosary was a key to this order, and its absence now meant that the killer was far more than just a murderer. They were part of something much larger, something that was still very much alive. Father Brown's mind raced as he pieced together the final clues. The rosary had been a signal, a marker for those involved in the order. The missing rosary meant that the killer was still connected to the conspiracy, still actively working to cover up the truth. But who could it be? And why had they chosen the priest as their victim? The answers were just out of reach, slipping through his fingers like sand. Father Brown's suspicions began to grow as he uncovered more information about the order. They were not just a group of religious zealots. They were a secret society, an organization that had been working behind the scenes for years, manipulating events to further their own agenda. But what was their ultimate goal? And who else was involved? The suspense reached a fever pitch when Father Brown discovered the identity of the killer. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an outsider. It was someone within the very heart of the church, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. And the most shocking part of it all, the killer had been wearing the rosary, using it as a tool to manipulate and control those around them. The rosary wasn't just a symbol, it was a weapon, a tool of power, and now it had been used to commit murder. But the mystery didn't end there. As Father Brown prepared to confront the killer, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The killer hadn't just taken the rosary. They had taken something else, something even more precious, something that could bring the entire conspiracy to light. The rosary had been the key to unlocking the truth, but now it was gone, and with it, the only evidence that could tie the killer to the conspiracy. But who had the rosary now, and what would they do with it? Father Brown's heart pounded as he prepared for the final confrontation. He knew who the killer was, and he knew that the truth was just within his grasp. But as he made his way toward the confrontation, he realized something even more terrifying. He wasn't the only one searching for the killer. There were others, people who had been following him, watching him, waiting for him to uncover the truth. And now, they were closing in. The final twist came when Father Brown stood face to face with the killer, his hand hovering over the key to the truth. But before he could speak, The killer turned and whispered the one thing Father Brown never expected to hear. "You're too late. The rosary is gone, and with it, the truth will never be revealed." The chilling words sent a shock through Father Brown. But before he could react, the killer vanished into the shadows, leaving Father Brown with nothing but the haunting realization that the truth had been lost forever. The rosary had been the key, but now it was gone, and with it, the answers to the murder, the conspiracy, and the darkness that had consumed the church for so long. "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of the mystery. "But the truth will never be told." And as he stood in the empty room, the silence pressing down on him, Father Brown knew that the killer was still out there, and the secrets they had buried would remain hidden for all eternity. Chapter 12. Father Brown found his faith. Father Brown stood in the chapel, staring at the cross as the truth finally settled in. It was never about finding the killer, it was about finding his own faith. The case had unraveled his understanding of everything he had believed in, and with every secret revealed, every layer peeled back, he found himself staring into a darkness that seemed to reach inside of him. There was something haunting in that realization. The faith he had held so firmly for years had now been shattered, and in its place, a new truth was emerging. But what did it mean? Was it the end of his journey, or had it only just begun? For weeks, Father Brown had been chasing shadows, solving one mystery after another, each darker and more twisted than the last. The town's secrets had weighed heavily on him, but it wasn't until this final case that he felt the true burden of what he had uncovered. The murders, the betrayals, the hidden sins, each one had drawn him deeper into a spiral of confusion. What if everything he thought he knew was wrong? What if faith, in its purest form, wasn't enough to face the darkness in the world? The body had been found, hidden behind the altar, and as Father Brown investigated, it became clear that this was not just another crime. It was a message. Someone was using the sanctity of the church to hide their darkest secrets, and the killer, as it turned out, was no stranger. But the deeper Father Brown dug, the more he realized that this was not just about murder, it was about power. The killer wasn't just hiding a crime. They were hiding something much larger, something that threatened the very foundation of everything Father Brown had ever believed. The town's faith had always been its cornerstone, a place of solace for the troubled, a refuge from the darkness of the outside world. But as Father Brown pieced together the last pieces of the puzzle, he realized that the church itself had become a prison, a place where people had been trapped by their own guilt, their own secrets. The killer, as it turned out, had been part of the church's very foundation, someone who had been so entwined with its history that no one suspected them until it was too late. But the truth of the crime wasn't as simple as it seemed. The more Father Brown uncovered, the more complicated the mystery became. The killer was not alone. They were part of something much larger, and as Father Brown uncovered the motivations behind the murder, he found himself questioning everything he had ever known about right and wrong, about justice and redemption. Could the killer ever truly be redeemed? Could Father Brown forgive them, or was the stain of their actions too deep to wash away? As Father Brown followed the trail of clues, he uncovered something chilling. The murder had been part of a ritual, a dark ceremony that had been passed down through generations. The killer's actions were part of a long-standing tradition, a secret that had been buried for centuries. And now, With each new revelation, Father Brown was faced with the terrifying possibility that the town's faith, its very belief in salvation, was built on lies. The first big reveal came when Father Brown discovered the true identity of the killer, a person he had trusted, someone who had been by his side all along. The truth hit him like a ton of bricks. How could he have missed it? How could he have been so blind to the truth that had been right in front of him? The killer had been using their position in the church to manipulate others, to control the flow of power, and now they had gone too far. The murder was just the beginning, and with it, the veil that had been covering the town's darkest secrets was finally lifted. But the mystery didn't end with the revelation of the killer's identity. As Father Brown began to confront the killer, he realized something even more terrifying. The killer didn't act alone. They were part of a much larger web of corruption, a network of people who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes for years. The killer's actions were just one piece of the puzzle, and now Father Brown was forced to confront the possibility that the entire town was involved in a conspiracy that stretched back centuries. As Father Brown navigated the labyrinth of lies and deceit, he uncovered more and more disturbing truths. The church, the very institution that had once been a source of strength for the people, had become a den of corruption. The rituals, the sacrifices, the manipulation, it was all part of a twisted game that had been played by those in power for generations. But what was the end game? What did the killer hope to achieve by taking so many lives, by burying so many secrets? Father Brown's mind raced as he pieced together the final clues. The killer's motive, it seemed, was not just about revenge or power, it was about control. They had orchestrated the murders, manipulating the church, the town, and everyone in it to achieve their own twisted vision of salvation. But who were they really? Who had they been working for? The more Father Brown uncovered, the more questions he had, and the more the mystery deepened. And then came the final twist, the one piece of the puzzle that Father Brown hadn't seen coming. As he confronted the killer, as he looked them in the eyes, he realized that the killer had been trying to save them all. The murders, the rituals, the twisted game they had been playing, it was all part of a desperate attempt to bring the town back to its true faith, to cleanse it of the darkness that had infected it for so long. But the price had been too high. The lies, the guilt, the blood, it had all built to this moment, this horrifying truth. But was it too late for Father Brown? Could he ever truly find his faith again, or had the darkness consumed him too? As he stood in the ruins of the church, with the weight of the mystery bearing down on him, he knew one thing for certain. The answers he had been seeking were not the ones he had wanted. The truth had been found, but it had come at a terrible cost. Father Brown closed his eyes for a moment, his mind overwhelmed by the gravity of what he had uncovered. "I know who did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "but the truth will never be told." And with that, he turned and walked away, knowing that the town and his own faith would never be the same again. The darkness had been revealed, but it had come at the price of everything he had ever believed in. And now, with the truth in his hands, Father Brown could only wonder if the cost was worth it.